In 2020, the Department of Education officials who administered the program became overwhelmed by the number of applicants seeking to register new feeding sites. All these new companies coming in, needing more money. Wow. They screamed at the government. They said, if you don't approve these minority-owned businesses, we're going to sue you for racism if you don't give us your money.
And you called him what many Americans do find an offensive word, retarded. Do you stand by that claim of calling Tim Walz retarded?
Yeah, I think there's something wrong with him.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Sure.
Good call.
You don't think that
You have a problem with it?
Tim Walz in big trouble. Hundreds of Minnesota employees now coming out and accusing Tim Walz of ignoring warnings about fraud, massive fraud, hundreds of millions of dollars. And they say he is 100% responsible for this. And Tim is apparently okay with some of the slings and arrows that are being thrown his way. But a lot is breaking on this story. And here you can see even the Minnesota House Republicans are saying, you know, today, finally, the New York Times is reporting to the rest of the country what everybody in Minnesota has already known. Fraud exploding to epic levels all over the place, and a lot of it, the Somalians. For years, whistleblowers were ignored, basic accountability and oversight nowhere to be found, and so we've had the worst fraud epidemic in the country. Now, finally, the rest of us can see it. And so, two stories here, one from Fox saying 400 current staff members say that the governor systematically retaliated against the whistleblowers. So if you watch this fraud happening and you said anything about it, Tim Walz, who almost was the vice president of this country, not almost, but you know, he was facilitating it, saying that 400 people accused him of failing to act on any of this. They say Tim Walz 100% responsible for the massive fraud in Minnesota. We let him know about this, but he systematically retaliated against all of us. He monitored us. He repressed us. He discredited all of our fraud reports and more. Now, the Justice Department announced new charges last week against the 78th defendant. They stole more than $250 million in stolen funds. And this started back in 22 when Biden was in there. Just adding defendants, $250 million, all going into the Somalians, feeding our future for the invaders. Got it. Not the children. But New York Times dropped this expose, and Tim Walz also caught, according to Dustin Grage, of getting a bunch of money from these fraudsters. $11,900 in campaign cash from one of their lawyers. And of course, when it came time for Tim Walz to go and investigate these organizations, he wouldn't subpoena their records. No, because he wanted the money and he wanted the votes, obviously. So here is the report from the New York Times. How fraud swamped Minnesota's system right on Tim Walz's watch. They say the Somalis, a group with growing political power, was largely responsible. Trump responding to a lot of this as well. But this has been staggering in its scale and brazenness. From the Times, federal prosecutors charged dozens of people with felonies for stealing a bunch of money. At first, many in the state saw this as just a one-off, just a couple of bad Somalis. But over the past 5 years, law enforcement officials say fraud took root. Millions of dollars. Now, 59 people have been convicted in those schemes, and more than $1 billion in taxpayer dollars have been stolen in 3 plots. $1 billion with a B. That's more than Minnesota spends annually to run its DOC. Now, this fraud stood out even in the context of rampant theft during the pandemic, and outrage is now burgeoning in Minnesota. In recent days, Trump called this out. He said Minnesota is a hub of fraud, and many Somalians say the fraud has damaged their reputation. Yeah. And around 80,000 people at the moment. Well, they can go complain to Ilhan. Debate over the fraud has opened new rifts between the Somali community and other Minnesotans, and has left some Somali Americans saying, we're unfairly facing a new layer of suspicion. Oh no, you're so suspicious. Why don't you go back to Somalia? People will be less suspicious there. Walz has instituted new fraud prevention safeguards. He defended himself, but this is raising even more questions. No one will support these programs if they're riddled with fraud. We're using our way of life in Minnesota for the Somalians. The first public sign of a major problem was in 22. Garland came out. They focused on a Minneapolis nonprofit organization called Feeding Our Future, partnered with dozens of feeding sites. State agencies reimbursed the group and its partners for invoices, but they weren't feeding anybody. Most of the meals were non-existent. They bought luxury cars, houses, even real estate projects. Behind the scenes, as investigators sifted through a bunch of this, they found other plots. Hundreds of providers were reimbursed for assistance that they claimed, but no services were provided at all. The annual cost of these services was $104 million in 1 year. $104 million 1 year, the authority said, from a budgeted projection of $2.6 million when it began in 20. 2 of 8 people charged have pleaded guilty, 6 others not guilty, others awaiting trial. But in another program, they were going to provide therapy to autistic kids. Yeah, unfortunately, no services to autistic kids. $14 million in fraud there. Another person called Ryan, the lawyer for Miss Hassan, said his client had entered into social services and then began to submit fraudulent invoices. Miss Hassan is of Somali ancestry. Oh, as are all but 8 of the 86 people charged in this Somalis. Mr. Pakia also has represented other people, said, well, nobody was doing anything. It was like someone was stealing money from the cooking jar and they just kept refilling it. Our stupid government. And then they would just give the money back to the politicians. Red flags in the meals program surfaced in the early months of the pandemic, but the money just kept flowing, baby. In 2020, the Department of Education officials who administered the program became overwhelmed by the number of applicants seeking to register new feeding sites. All these new companies coming in, needing more money. They said, this is weird. So then Feeding Our Future responded with a warning. In an email, they told the state agency that failing to promptly approve new applicants, wow, they screamed at the government. They said, if you don't approve these minority-owned businesses, we're going to sue you for racism if you don't give us your money. Then they sued the agency, okay, these Somalis, which continued reimbursing claims and approving new sites in the months that followed. A report came out saying that the state was just handing them money. This Somali American, who was formerly working as a fraud investigator, they were reluctant to take steps because the Somalis would call them racist, obviously. So like, oh, well, they're stealing $1 billion. Should we do something about it? What are you, a bigot? There is a perception that forcefully tackling this issue might cause political backlash. They are a core voting bloc, so they're allowed to steal. As a trial in the meals fraud case was coming to a close, an attempt to bribe a juror also got caught, and Thompson, as a career prosecutor, said this is outrageous. This is a huge part of the problem. Allegations of racism can destroy your whole career. So Tim Walz didn't want to be called a racist, and you need the Somalis to vote for you. So they began shutting down some fraud, and now some people are being charged. Dozens came into a Somali mall in Minneapolis. Faith leaders decried Trump's statements, and Trump came out swinging against them. And of course, we saw the DOJ started to prosecute people years ago, and now we're finding that it just continues on and on and on. The state is riddled with Somali fraudsters, and Trump was commenting about this over on Air Force One over the weekend. Here's what he had to say.
And you called him what many Americans do find an offensive word, retarded. Do you stand by that claim of calling Tim Walz retarded?
Yeah, I think there's something wrong with him.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Sure.
Good call.
You don't think that...
You have a problem with it? You know what? I think there's something wrong with him. Anybody that would do what he did, anybody that would allow those people into his state and pay billions of dollars out to Somalia. We give billions of dollars to Somalia. It's not even a country because it doesn't function like a country. It's got a name, but it doesn't function like a country. There's something wrong with Walz.
Yeah, something's definitely wrong with him. And the president was not calling Tim Walz retarded because he is retarded. He was calling him retarded because he was acting retarded. So I think it's allowed. According to, I think that was Michael Scott in the office who said that that was appropriate. So that's the rule, and Trump's just following it. Meanwhile, Tim Walz says, it's okay. I don't mind being called that because I know that's what I am.
Look, Donald Trump insulting me is a badge of honor for me, but I think we all know, as both as an educator for a couple decades and as a parent, using that term is just so damaging. It's hurtful. We have fought 3 decades to get this out of our schools. Kids know better than to use it. But look, this is what Donald Trump has done. He's normalized this type of hateful behavior and this type of language. And mainly, look, at first, I think it's just because he's not a good human being. But secondly, to distract from his incompetency. We know we just came through a Thanksgiving where prices are up. We know people are concerned about heating their homes as we're experiencing blizzards out here at the same time.
Well, maybe they could afford it if the Somalians didn't take $100 million or $1 billion out of your budget, retard. All right, so that's Tim Walz. Sorry, I had to do it. Here's more coming out from Caroline Levitt. She said, yeah, he is a dumb person. Here is Caroline from the press briefing today talking about Tim Walz.
About how Somali immigrants in Minnesota have been ripping off American taxpayers. In fact, 86 people have been charged in a rampant and widespread fraud scheme spanning multiple programs in Minnesota. Of those 86, 78 of those people are Somali, 91% of them charged. So far, 59 of those people have been convicted for their roles in fraud plots that have stolen $1 billion from taxpayers. In one scheme, and this is egregious, a nonprofit and its affiliates with these Somali migrants claimed to have fed tens of thousands of American children during the pandemic. They were reimbursed for those meals by taxpayers. However, federal prosecutors found that almost all of those meals were never even delivered to hungry children. In fact, those organizations' leaders spent the money on houses, luxury cars, and real estate in Turkey and Kenya. About how
Kenya? They took our money from America to Kenya and went over there? Well, I don't care where they stay. Pick an African country. It can be Somalia or whatever, or Kenya. I don't care. But they can go back over there. They can steal from their own people. They don't need to come here and steal from our people to the tune of $1 billion. So Tim Walz might even be complicit in that. Maybe he'll be indicted along with the rest of them. We'll keep our eye on this one, my friends. Thank you for subscribing and joining as we do.